After the first episode of The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, I found that the show was incredibly bland, often really generic, that there aren't really much standout characters or standout scenes, that it's mostly seemingly people who don't want to be there. There's not really a lot of emotion or passion that I feel coming off the screen, and it doesn't help that the effects don't always look very good, that it's seemingly often done on blue screen or green screen, and that they work less with sets, and the sets that there are really really not that great. I mean, for such a big budget, you'd expect at least some miniatures, or what they called in the Lord of the Rings appendices to the extended edition, bigatures, like these massive miniatures on a larger scale for closer shots and all that. Um, I expected more with the budget. Apologies for my voice. I've been a bit sick lately. Um, but yeah, this episode, I hope that it improves. I mean, I don't wish the actors ill will or anything like that. I just wanted to see a good show. But I mean, what they've put out so far isn't really what you'd expect from such a high budget and so much praise from all the outlets. So let's see if episode 2 is any better. I decided to split up this episode into the four main storylines, which makes it easier for me to follow, but it also makes it easier when you're viewing this to just follow through with the whole storyline. um, at least I think it's easier. Um, but we basically get the storyline of Galadriel after she jumped ship. We get the Harfoots, we get Elrond, and we get Bronwyn and Arondir, who are traipsing around. They get split up, but I'll get to that later. So let's start with Galadriel. So after she jumps ship, she is basically alone in the deep dark sea, and she's staring to the west, looking at some stars, probably to orient her. But we have no idea where she is. For example, in relation to Linden, in relation to Numenor. We know that she's in the water. So yeah, nothing much to say about that. How much far north she is of Numenor. So yeah, we're basically also left in the dark. So she's swimming, and then we get this shot from beneath, which of course indicates that there is terror living in the seas, and we've seen it already in the trailer that there's like a big Godzilla monster floating around in the Sundering Seas. So that's probably that viewpoint we get from the monster that is looking at Galadriel like a nice easy snack that is floating around alone in the sea. Luckily, Galadriel gets rescued by a raft of people who are also there, but since we don't know where they are, they could be uh, sailing from Numenor, they could have been sailing from the Southlands to Numenor. Um, it's possible, but we don't know it because we don't have a map where it's indicated, or where we have an approximate indication for where she is. So we get these people who are like not at first not really willing to help her, because she's a stranger. I mean, she's alone in the water, and you're not going to help her. That's like a bit nasty. And we get our first introduction to Halbrand, who says something really dumb. He says the tides of fate are flowing. Yours may be heading in or out. Yeah, obviously they're heading in or out. There's only two directions the tide goes in. I mean, she would know that. I mean, everybody knows that who's at sea. It's really something dumb. Um, so they ask her how she got there, and she says, I got separated from my ship, and one guy says, attacked, because of course he's indicating that there's a worm, and then she hasn't seen it. But that guy also, he pulls back her hair and he says, she's an elf. And then this lady goes, you liar. And I'm wondering why. You didn't ask her who she was, where she came from. You ask how she got there, and she literally says, I got separated from my ship, which is the truth. It was intentional, but it's the truth. She got separated from her ship because she jumped off it. So why this woman says she's a liar, I don't know. I don't know, this makes no sense at all. Luckily for us, they get attacked by Godzilla, and the whole thing goes down. Galadriel is already in the water because that woman threw her off, because she thinks she led the monster right to them. She swam in a random direction, so no. Also, something that is really weird is maybe in the heat of the moment I can understand it, but still, it's like something really odd that's happening in the storyline, with just weird dialogue and weird logic going around, which is seemingly a red line through the series so far. Luckily, Galadriel gets rescued once more, this time by Elrond on a part of the float, and she's looking angry. She's not happy about it, seemingly that she got rescued, that she's on a nice little float and she's a bit safe for the monster. And look at the design of the raft is basically to look like the monster. So when she first sees the raft coming out of the mists, you get the indication that she thinks that it is that monster. And then they get like this conversation that goes on for a while about why she is there and where he is from, and he's not really willing to say because his home is destroyed. And he doesn't see a reason to go back to it because it is destroyed. And Galadriel, just wants to know where the enemy is, how many there were, but like he cares. His home is destroyed. There's no empathy from her at all. She isn't like, I'm sorry for your loss. I'll leave it be for the time when I might ask more questions if we're rescued. No, it's like they're on a floating raft struggling to survive, and she's like asking all these questions that might annoy him. So it's not really smart to do that to your savior. So basically, this goes on and on and on, and Galadriel ties rope to a log for no reason at all. I don't know. It's just a log that is hanging there, and she's like tying a rope around it for some reason, but I haven't seen any reason apart from that she gets, caught in a rope and then just sinks down. So maybe that's the reason. And she's basically, just implying that he needs to tell her where the enemy is. And he says this beautiful thing. Killing orcs, if you want to go off and killing orcs, it's fine, but don't put it as heroism. And then she gets angry again, saying that she has lost so much to the enemy that he wouldn't even know. But, he's a human. She's immortal, so, you can't really compare those things. Of course, she has lost more because in this time period that they live is so much longer. He has lost his entire life. She still has other elves. She still has family. Gilgalad is her grandnephew. She has Elrond, who is her grandson. So she has family. She has still people to care about. But he has lost everything. So yeah, of course he sees it as bleak. He doesn't want some kind of person who pretends to be a hero on his raft, who's just seemingly laughing at him. Now we get a storm. Galadriel sinks down attached to the log she was tying to the boat, and she gets rescued again by Elrond. But she gets on the boat her own, and then she needs to help Elrond onto the ship. um, which is, I mean, indicating that she is like, she doesn't need the help of a man to get up there. Um, I mean, this is based on what the character has done so far and how she has been behaving. It's could also be helpful, but it falls flat if you've seen the first episode, if you've seen how obnoxious she is, and how basically she thinks only of herself. Um, so yeah, maybe she's like, oh, I still need to help this guy get up, so he doesn't drown. Um, so yeah, then Halbrand gets up and the storm goes on, and then luckily, after the storm subsides, we get this nice sunshine, and then Galadriel looks up to this mystery figure who is, of course, Lloyd Owens, Elendil. Um, he looks like him, so I suppose it's Elendil, and the ship looks like the Numenorean ships we've seen in the teasers. So that's probably him. So we have still no indication where they are in relation to any of the ghosts. To in relation to Numenor, of course, in a storm you can drift far south, which would make sense then that Elendil is there. Although it would make more sense that they've floated back a long way to the east, to the southeast, because at that point in the Second Age, the faithful, um, whose leader was Elendil, were basically in a ghetto in Romena, which was the eastern seaport of Numenor. So they were all put together so that the Kingsmen could, um, you know, control them and see what they were doing and see who they were trading with, because no elf um, had been coming to Numenor for a long time. There were no more lords of Andunia, which was one of the main western seaports, and who traded often with Tol Eressëa um, in the beginning. So, this has been thousands of years ago, and in the meantime, these kings had been speaking out against the Valar, against the immortality of the elves, and all that. They wanted more and more and more. They wanted to go west because they had seen everything in the east. Um, so, I mean, we'll probably get that tension shot that Galadriel arrives in Numenor and that the people are looking weird at her because they haven't seen an elf in like thousands of years. She wouldn't have been welcome at all, and she wouldn't get an audience with the king, who is not king in the series. So, but that remains to be seen in the next episode, probably. Um, so that was that for Galadriel's storyline. It was basically floating around in the sea and having meaningless conversations about her own pride and ego, which in the second age would have subsided. In the first stage, yeah, fine. She was still proud in the beginning. She wanted to rule lands of her own. But of course, after the first kinslaying and her hatred for Feanor, she wanted to go, against Feanor, not necessarily in physical combat, but with, thwarting his plans, being ahead of him, honing her wisdom, being, more wise than he. Um, but all that has been left out. So um, there's not much character development in Galadriel now. She's still arrogant, and she still thinks of her quest as the most important thing that anyone could ever perceive. Even though Halbrand has lost his entire life, his where he lived, his family, all that. He even lost his fellow survivors. So there's no empathy in Galadriel so far. Um, so hopefully this gets resolved. I doubt it, but we'll see in the next episode probably. Then we get to the Harfoots, who are just basically there to meet a stranger. We get this nice reflection back to the Fellowship of the Ring, where Gandalf has put the ring in Frodo's hand, saying that it's not hot. Nori falls literally in a pit of a meteor, um, you know, on the molten ground, and she's like, "This is not hot." This is so incredibly weird because even though The comet might not have been hot. I mean, the impact crater would have been. I mean, the ground is molten. If the rock itself of the meteor isn't hot, yeah, fine, of course, it's magic. But the trees that are burning around it and the grass that's on fire, that would be hot. I mean, you unless the stranger has like this effect to cool everything around him to create fire that is not warm. Um, it's a weird scene. I mean, I just think they did that line to say, you remember this from the Fellowship of the Ring? Yeah, you do. Look, we did it as well. Isn't that nice? No, it's not. It's dumb. I mean, you know, you would have the heat. I mean, there's, these little flecks of fire that are floating around from, trees that are on fire and bits of wood that go up in flames. That could touch your skin and that would have been hot. So, um, it's a weird scene. But then we get Lenny Henry and his two counseling women who are there to look at the omens, and Malva, the one on the left, says, I mean, this is a bad omen, we should cancel the harvest festival. And Sadok, so played by Lenny Henry, he's like, well, let's not be rash, and then off with you. And basically the scene is there so that Sadok, when he turns around, doesn't see that Nori steals two of the lanterns, and that Poppy probably steals that wheelbarrow right from under his nose. So now we get the scene where Nori and Poppy are pulling up the stranger in a wheelbarrow, and they stop to talk in the middle of a hill about why Nori is so attracted to adventure and that she can't let it go. And then, of course, they let go of the wheelbarrow, and we get this supposedly fun moment that the wheelbarrow is rolling down. And I mean, who didn't see that coming? I mean, we're on a hill with a wheelbarrow with two stupid characters, so what do you expect? Yeah, the wheelbarrow to go down, obviously. So they have to run all the way across it, and Poppy is like, I mean, catch it, catch it. And Nori says, I mean, now you care for him. And she's like, no, I don't care for that man. I care for the wheelbarrow. It's not mine. I mean, it's like, okay, yeah, fine. I don't care about these characters either because, I mean, they're just there for filler, actually. I mean, the stranger probably serves a better purpose in the story. He's probably one of the wizards in the Second Age, um, which is not in the appendices as well. So they don't care what's in the appendices about what they have the rights to. Um, but yeah, the hobbits are just there. Now he gets some snails from Nori while he's writing some runes, and it's implied that she can't read them. So we've also seen that Sadok has a book full of hieroglyphics, so she probably can't read runes. Um, and then we get also this very dramatic moment where Largo has, twisted his foot by, after a rope snapped and he fell down after, he had to put up a relatively light-looking log or tree trunk for the party tent. It, it didn't really look that heavy even for a hobbit. So it's a weird scene, but probably indicates that, I mean, Largo is just sitting around, doesn't have any muscles whatsoever, and just twists his foot. Also because Nori isn't there, so Nori should have been there to help him, which also indicates that Nori doesn't care. Really, she's a kid, so yeah, kids go off sometimes and then leave their parents to do chores on themselves, or they don't want to do chores and they sit in their room. So that's basically Nori. She goes off on her own adventures while her family has to do her chores, and then you get stuff like this. Back to the stranger, where he makes like a constellation, and Nori's like, I don't know these stars, but I know where to find them. And then of course all the fireflies also die, so the stranger just kills off a bunch of fireflies, and he kills Poppy's lantern basically. Um, what's weird about this scene as well is that Nori says that she thinks she might know where to find these stars, and I have no idea how she would do that, because I mean it's not indicated that she can read. It's only Sadok has a book from the Hobbits, so it's indicated that he can read this hieroglyphic script. Um, but it's not indicated that any of the other hobbits can actually read this hieroglyphic script. And since they are migrating, it is also probable that they um, don't read any of the runes, any of the elven scripts, any of the human scripts. So I don't know where she would find it. Will she go to the library in Armendalos? I mean, take the boat to Numenor and then go asking for, some scripts about some constellation, or go to the elves and then make a drawing, which is presumably what will happen. She goes off with a stranger to some elves and then make a drawing of these stars, which look very distinctly like the mark of Sauron, uh, which it might be. So again, this is just Hobbit filler. It doesn't really serve a purpose apart from, introducing us to the stranger, and what the stranger does. He's like this bewildered character who doesn't know where he is. He doesn't know what he does apparently. So it's basically just for that. The hobbits, I mean, there's no story there. They've put up a party tent in this episode, and that's it. And Largo has twisted his foot, and they probably, they stole a bunch of lanterns and some snails. So yeah, not really much to look at actually. Now we go to the most interesting storyline actually in this episode, is the one from Elrond. And we see this beautiful shot of Eregion. This is probably Ostin Edil, the capital of Eregion, where Celebrimbor and his elven smiths had their capital. Um, so it's a beautiful shot. It's an effects shot. It's probably not a miniature. Maybe part of it is, I don't know. I haven't seen the making of. Um, Maybe there will be one. Maybe there will not be one. It would be interesting to see one as well. I mean, to see what they actually built of in terms of sets and what they used in terms of designs. So that would be nice. Um, but back to the story, we're here in Eregion, and you'd expect like this master craftsman and ruler of Eregion to have like a nicer office, but it's just a generic fantasy room with a bookcase, with a table, with some cups and a pitcher, and a drawing board, which you would expect from an architect or craftsman. And what is beautiful in this scene is that we get a little bit more exposition, because Celebrimbor has the hammer of Fëanor, who wrought the Silmarils with it. Um, the Silmarils that instigated the war between the elves and Morgoth, and the eventual destruction of Beleriand. Um, and Celebrimbor is the last surviving grandson of Fëanor, so he has this inherent quality for craftsmanship and creating beautiful things. But I mean, if you look at Celebrimbor now, you don't really see a ruler or a master craftsman. You see, it's more like a merchant. I mean, he has like this velvet robes, and just a generic haircut. Actually, you don't really see the pointy ears. You can see them a bit, um, but it's not really clear that he's an elf. If you would put him in a crowd of humans, you would say, I mean, this guy is a merchant. He's a wealthier guy, but not distinctly elven. And we get to know why Elrond is there. It's to build a forge, and I wonder what this forge will be used for. Could it be the forging of the Rings of Power? Oh, who knows? Who knows? Who knows? Um, and he doesn't say why. He just needs like a big forge that is really hot, that will birth a flame that is hotter than a dragon's fire, and all that. So it's a nice design. It actually looks a bit like Middle Earth. It looks like something the elves would build with some organic flowing lines, but still a functional design. And Elrond is basically saying that he needs to get an alliance with the dwarves. because Celebrimbor doesn't get a workforce to build it. And I mean, he says that's why you are here, Elrond. You're here to provide me with a workforce. Um, because Elrond is, of course, a diplomat. He's the herald of Gilgalad, which is true according to the books. In the Second Age, he is the herald of Gilgalad prior to the rise of Sauron. He still remains the herald of Gilgalad after, probably during the Lost Lines as well. So they get to the west gate of Moria, to Khazad-dûm. Just the two of them. This is a diplomatic mission, or supposed to be a diplomatic mission, but they're just two guys, the ruler of Eregion and the Herald of Gilgalad, which gives, of course, a lot of authority, but I mean, it doesn't say much to the dwarves. If you would go with a diplomatic, um, you know, um, group, you would have at least several persons, like merchants, who can say, like, I mean, we can trade this for this. Um, you know, we can trade crafted jewels for ores. We can trade tools for ingots and all that. We can trade food for minerals. Um, you could do so much with a diplomatic, group, and this is just two guys there. It's also weird that Celebrimbor doesn't have a relationship with the dwarves of Moria at this point, because these guys have been mining at the end of the Second Age for a few thousand years already. So they would have massive deposits of gold, ingots of silver, of other materials. And of course, the elven smiths would need that for their creation. So it's weird that the elves don't have a diplomatic relationship already with the dwarves, but this is just basically done. This logic is thrown away, just for Elrond to, enter Khazad-dûm and reunite with his friend Durin and introduce us to Durin. It's not really used as a diplomatic mission. It's basically to set up some conversation for later. We get to enter Khazad-dûm, and I mean, this is a nice shot of some of the living area, of the waterfalls, and we also get some shots of crops being grown with mirror light. What's also weird in this scene is the guards of Elrond. They are in really uncomfortable armor. They have really long beards. They have nice ceremonial face masks, but they are waddling in their armor. It doesn't look comfortable. It doesn't look like they can fight, and they really, their arms are a bit outstretched. They can't really hold their arms together. Their legs are, probably also not in a comfortable position. The body is really tight, so it's not really a functional suit of armor, it seems. Of course, yeah, it could have its reasons that it's just a ceremonial function and they're not used to waddling to the other end of the bridge. It's possible that they have to stand still, and then, I mean, your suit, um, they could have had something like, I mean, your suit doesn't have to be comfortable, it has to look good, but yeah, it doesn't look that good. It's basically scale armor, not really something you'd expect from a ceremonial gatekeeper. Then Elrond gets escorted to a back room, because he has to invoke the right of Sigyn Tarak, and Sigyn Tarak translates as Longbeard. So this is the right of the Longbeards. It's supposed to be some initiation ritual, but it's held in like this little back room where we have a cross section of the dwarven population, where the wealthy have robes that are really similar to what the elves wear. We have some artisans. We have this guy on the right who has like really generic Viking helm, Viking horns that you'd expect in the 1960s movies about Vikings. We also get the shot of a lady dwarf in boob armor. I mean, which is such a generic trope at this point. It's really getting annoying. It's getting stale. I mean, there's no use to do that. You don't need to make boob armor. It's not necessary. It looks ridiculous. I mean, these dwarves, the armored dwarves, in this scene, all look really, um, they look ridiculous. The dwarves in their normal clothing, they look like artisans and just general people. They have like a Roman slash medieval style. So we see a woman on the right here in a toga like um, piece that you'd expect in a Roman historical epic. And you have also dwarves in seemingly, ragged clothes, and also some people that you would say have, generic medieval tunics. We get introduced to Durin III, the Prince of Khazad-dûm, and his costume actually looks nice. He looks like the stern dwarf. This angry dwarf, his beard is actually tucked in his belt, seemingly with like a clasp. Um, and I mean, this is a nice armor, with the points. It also doesn't really look comfortable, but for a prince, it needs to be ceremonial and fancy. Just it needs to look nice rather than be functional in Khazad-dûm because they're safe in their dwarven city. We get to know what the rite of Sikin Tarak is, and it's basically just smashing rocks. The terms are that if Durin wins, Elrond gets expelled from Khazad-dûm forever, and if Elrond wins, he gets an audience with the king, and he can get to say his proposal. Of course, Elrond loses, which was to be expected because, I mean, these guys have been smashing rocks for thousands of years, so they would have been skilled in smashing rocks. Um, and it's like, okay, yeah, Elf loses, so he gets expelled, and Elrond is like, okay, but can you at least escort me to the exit? And Durin is like, okay, yeah, fine, sure. They ride the elevator, which, I mean, they didn't go that way. So Elrond entered to the through the west gate, so they would go back to the west gate, obviously. But they walked along a pathway. It's possible that there was a lift, but we don't get to see it. So now Durin and Elrond basically get this long lift ride to get to their conversation. I mean, this lift ride is actually the best scene in the series that I've seen. It's actually something that conveys emotion and empathy from both characters. Um, so Elrond is like, I mean, your city has changed a lot since I was last here. And Durin says, yeah, 20 years will do that. Upon which Elrond says, has it been only 20 years? Of course, he's an elf. He's already lived thousands of years. He has seen the end of an age and the beginning of a new one. So for Durin, this is like a long time because he has had his wedding. He has two kids now, and Elrond missed all that, and then gets there and demands to get an audience based on their friendship. Durin says, I mean, you can't just come barging in here and demand what you have so easily squandered. Um, and I think it's really a beautiful scene because Durin has lived a lifetime in these 20 years while Elrond was absent doing his work for Gil-galad, writing speeches and all that. Um, so, of course, Elrond has had his other obligations, but I mean, he claims friendship to a person he hasn't seen in 20 years. So, it's understandable that Durin is angry, but of course, it's a diplomatic mission. And then just saying, yeah, I'll exile you forever without listening to the proposal is also a bit odd. But I mean, and if you just look at it from a friendship perspective, that he goes there as a friend, then it's understandable why he would say, bugger off for now. We'll see in a few years if my mind changes, and then you might come back. But exiling him forever is like a bit harsh. So eventually, Elrond says, I would like to apologize to your wife, to your kids. Durin says, like, okay, come on to my apartment, which is conveniently close to the lift. And we get our first look at Disa, and actually Sophia Nomvete plays this character with a bit more, you have this uh, jovialness, this joyfulness to this character, and it's actually nice. I mean, the character is completely fabricated, but at least her personality isn't really that obnoxious. Um, she is, happy to see Elrond, but her Scottish accent is terrible. I mean, it has to be said, and the Scottish accent is terrible, just like the Irish accents of the Harfoots are terrible. And you hear that she is actually a British actress because her Scottish accent isn't always that consistent. But her character is actually decent. Um, it's not someone I'll get to care about a lot, I think, because it's more a side character, I believe, for now. So maybe we see more developments later. But if you just look at it from a character perspective, it's fine. I mean, she's good. She isn't botching the acting. She is seemingly actually genuinely happy to be there. We get also introduced to Durin's kids, who are named Gerda and Gamli. Gamli. I was like, seriously, Gamli. You couldn't have come up with a better name, like Durin the Fifth, um, or Durin. Yeah, the prince is Durin the Fourth. I made a mistake earlier, saying Durin the Third, I believe, but Durin the Fifth instead of Gamli. Maybe would have sounded better, but those are also two characters that probably we won't see a lot of. I think this might be the only scene where they're in, so just throw them out of the story. They're just there to introduce us to the fact that Durin has two kids, which he has said to Elrond, and then we get to know the kids that they're just playing around with some copper heads or bronze heads bumping into each other. They get to dinner, and I mean, this is really a long conversation. It's just a dinner party, basically. Um, and there's not really much of story-wise of a story in this conversation. We only get to know what resonating is and basically singing to the rocks and knowing what ores are there, but it's nothing more. It's basically just again a bit of filler. So this resonating, this conversation could have been cut short, and this resonating could have been mentioned, and it was like just a short shot of them having dinner and then ending the storyline, because this it goes on for a while. It tells of how Durin and Disa met. I mean, how she was in love with him, or how he was in love with him, that it took so many weeks for him to court her. So it drags on a bit, but I mean, the previous scene with in the lift was actually a nice scene. And the conclusion of this storyline is Durin the Third, um, played by Peter Mullen. On the left, the King of Khazad-dûm, shows Durin the Fourth a little chest with a glowing light coming out of it, which is probably the first mithril that has been found. Um, of course, we know that Moria is famous in the Third Age for its products in mithril. So it's obvious that this is mithril that he shows him, and Peter Mullen, or Durin the Third, is a bit suspicious of Elrond because he just arrives there at the moment that they find mithril, which I would find suspicious as well. So it's only logical that he has his doubts about the intentions of Elrond. But of course, Elrond doesn't know anything about it because he hasn't been there for 20 years. Um, and the elves seemingly don't have contact with Khazad-dûm, so it would be weird that he knew that. But I get where Durin the Third comes from, and Peter Mullen really plays this well. He really conveys his dwarven character, and he really fits the character as well. So I mean, I think he's the best character so far. I mean, he really looks the part. He plays the part. His energy is right. Um, so I feel that he was like an ideal candidate to play a dwarven king. So that concludes this storyline. Get to the final storyline, which is Bronwyn and Arondir. We still have like nothing of chemistry between them. They're supposed to be in love, but it's just they just talk. It's nothing of emotion coming of either of them, which you would expect from a more stoic elf. But since they're in love, you would expect more chemistry, so at least some smiles or some love eyes or all that. Um, Nothing of that. It's basically Arondir and Bronwyn just talking. Bronwyn is basically saying that these people living here were actually good people. They had families, they had all that. Well, Arondir said in the first episode that, I mean, these people served Morgoth, and the Watch Warden says these people haven't changed. So, I mean, Arondir is clearly similar of intention regarding the people of Hordern and of Tir Harad. Um, he also says that there are no captives, so they've probably been taken all the humans hostage, or as slaves, to work in um, Moria in Mordor, on, you know, anything, fortresses, mining stuff, making weapons, all of that. We also don't see anything of the black goo. There's like a sheep carcass there, but there's no black goo. So I'm wondering where this black goo comes from, and how it's, how it's found. Because in the first episode we see Arondir milking this cow, and there's this black goo coming out of it. At the end of the episode we get Gilgalad, who um, catches a leaf or turns over a leaf, and there's like this black goo veins on it. But there's so much distance between Tir Harad and the Grey Havens that you would expect that more people, more elves would have seen this phenomenon. Um, you know, in Eregion, there are also trees. So, I mean, why don't the leaves in Eregion have black goo? Why don't have the cows in Khazad-dûm? Why don't they have black goo? So, I mean, what is the purpose of this? It's just, a thing. It's like an item that's there for seemingly no reason apart from to show that there is evil. But we don't see any of the black goo in this episode. Nothing at all. And then we get Arondir jumping into this tunnel, and before that he has this beautiful conversation with Bronwyn, where he says, I need to go in the other direction. Um, Not in the direction that they're digging, but in the direction that they're coming from. And Bronwyn is like, I mean, why? You don't know what's in there, indicating that she thinks it might be dangerous, which is a valid concern in this case, because there's a big tunnel. The whole town has disappeared, so you don't know what's on the other end. You also don't know what they're digging towards, although it is Tir Harad. But I mean, he doesn't know who's there. There could be an army of orcs for all he knows, or Sauron himself, or maybe, a big scary spider or a worm. I mean, he doesn't know it. It could be very dangerous for an elf alone, so it's a valid concern. But he says, I mean, that's the reason why I must go, which is such a stupid answer. Um, I mean, he goes into danger willingly, alone, could die, and then nobody, if he dies, nobody would know what's in there. Um, it's just, a dark tunnel, possibly with very dangerous enemies, and he just goes in alone. I mean, no help, because all the other watch wardens and elves are gone, probably. So he's in there alone. And Bronwyn goes off running to Tir Harad to warn these people. And then, of course, she goes to the council of white men in rags, drunk white men in rags actually, who don't believe her, obviously, because she's a woman, probably. And she says that they need to go. And this guy, half naked guy, is like, I mean, the ground has always been trembling and all that, but I mean, I would be concerned if the village next over would have completely been destroyed, and that there were tunnels underneath it, and that all of the people were gone. I would go. I mean, this is just a stupid man apparently, and these other people are stupid as well. They're not only drunk and dressed in rags, they're idiots. Luckily, Bronwyn is there to get some intelligence to the screen. Otherwise, this would have been completely gone awry. Do you remember the mice from the first episode? Because, I mean, apparently they are not mice, but orcs digging beneath the house of Bronwyn and Theo. And Theo sees this like milk white eye, which looks scary. I have to say that it looks nice, and it also conveys a bit of this energy that you had in the Fellowship of the Ring movie, of that shot where Gollum climbs the ladder in Khazad-dûm, and you just see his eyes light up. I got a bit of the same feeling there, but you know, he's like, you know, an orc under the floorboards, and I mean he had been smacking it the floorboard with an iron tool. So I mean he could smack this orc with an iron tool, but he's scared. Obviously, I would be scared as well. It's a freaking orc. Meanwhile, Arondir gets captured by other long-clawed orcs. So probably in the next episode we get the scene where he's tied in chains and needs to fight something. And we get a fight with the orc. It goes on for a while. I mean, Theo stabs it. Theo tries to run away. Bronwyn stabs it, and eventually Theo ties a rope around his neck, but it snaps, and then Bronwyn just cuts off its head and presents the head to the council of drunk white men in rags, saying that they should leave, and now they heed the warning and they will pack up to leave. Just before they leave, Theo takes the Sauron blade, and a drop of his blood is running towards it, and makes it's a nice effect that we get afterwards, like the sword that's been growing with some fiery effect. It looks nice, but we don't get to see all of it, so he just puts it in his bag, and they are on their merry way. So basically, that's it for this episode. To be fair, if you're just looking at the stories, they are more consistent. They aren't all over the place, you know, running off to this place or that place. It's more consistent, more linear, but there's so much filler. I mean, the Harfoots are completely filler. Um, Bronwyn and Arondir are also filler, but they at least serve a better purpose. I mean, they serve the purpose to probably spread the word that there is evil growing in the east, while the Harfoots are just there for the stranger, something that could have been abandoned completely, and the stranger could have been wandering around on his own and, you know, come into contact with the elves without the Harfoots. They're just there for a blast from the past. They're just there to get this link to the trilogy, to the Lord of the Rings, to hobbits, because people like hobbits in that story because they fit in the story. They serve a very important purpose in the story of the Lord of the Rings. While here they're just there, they're filler, they're supposed to be comedic relief, but other than that, nothing. Still, I mean, you have some nice looking shots, like this shot is relatively nice, um, but it's also bland. There are, I mean, the shot of Khazad-dûm was nice, but then you get in this plain back room, um, a small back room, um, where you would expect, you know, at least this is an official, you know, a ride, so wouldn't you get to a larger room, like maybe a central gathering room or a council room or something like that, maybe even the royal chambers or the audience hall of the king. Why not? He's an elf. It's supposed to be 20 years since he last went there, so you would expect like a grander event, you know, in the first elf in 20 years to step into Khazad-dûm, and, you know, to invoke the right of the Longbeards. It would be a grand occasion, so why is this in this little back room? Also, the story of Galadriel and Halbrand is also just filler. It's just, I mean, people floating around and Galadriel being angry and Halbrand being angry, um, and Halbrand saving Galadriel twice without a word of thanks. Um, the only thing he gets is like more arrogance from Galadriel. So um, this isn't really boding well for her character at all. We've seen some clips from the teasers in Numenor where she's also angry. So most of the time of the series, I feel that she will be angry and arrogant, um, which is not consistent with any of the stories that Tolkien has written about her. Even in the unfinished tale where she fought during the first kinslaying with the Teleri against the Noldor. Um, it's the only fight where she is specifically mentioned, but they don't have the rights to that. They have the rights to the appendices and the books of the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, where she isn't mentioned doing any fighting at all. What she did is defend her realm at the end of the War of the Ring, because Lothlorien and Mirkwood were assailed by orcs, and she used her ring to deter them. And eventually, there's a force of elves which she and Thrawn will lead to Dol Guldur, and she tears down this fortress with her magic, but she doesn't do any sword fights in there. Um, so they don't have the rights to the fight that she might have had, where she might have used a sword. Um, so it's this character is so fabricated, and the dialogue, it feels off. It's arrogant. It's brash. It's supposed to be this elf in her youth, but in the second age, I mean, the wisdom that Galadriel had gathered was already enormous. Um, in the first stage, she was even described as being the greatest of the Noldor, um, and it doesn't convey that she's just an angry kid here, and it's annoying because this is not Galadriel. Um, even if you even if you want to show her in her youth, in the second age, you would have more serenity, more control over emotions, and this character doesn't have that. Also, the music again is so blanded; it doesn't convey anything. You just get this harder, more rhythmic music in Khazad-dûm, and it's fine. And that's the only theme where I have something like, okay, these are dwarves, but the rest of the music is again so generic. It's it's sad actually. Then they couldn't come up with something more, you know, fantasy-like or uh, more original in fantasy, because these music themes we've heard over and over. It's the same music for landscape shots. It's the same music for tension shots. It's the same music for these comedic scenes. It's always the same music. It's just a generic fantasy theme in music. It's not really anything distinct. They would play the soundtrack of the Rings of Power, and you would get a list of 10 fantasy shows where there are also dwarves and elves and magic and dragons and whatever you want. You're asked, from which series is this? I mean, not everyone would recognize it as Rings of Power. Majority would, probably indicate another series, or just if you get multiple options, just tick off all the boxes because it's so generic. If you play the music from the Lord of the Rings trilogy, people recognize it, people know it as the Lord of the Rings, and they want to make a show that honors Tolkien and that stands apart from the trilogy that Peter Jackson made, but they can't make a music theme that is distinct for this show, that conveys emotion, that conveys tension, but in a way that when you hear it separately, that this is from that show, this is from the Rings of Power, I recognize it. But it's also generic. Also, the costumes are uninspired. They're seemingly taken from a history book and then just made into a costume, sometimes with a bit more gold thread or silver linings and a bit more decoration, but they're generic. It's really sad to see money being thrown at it at all, from all places, and it's just this. It's not impressive. It might be a massive production, but it's not impressive. You don't see these $500 million coming off the screen. Not at all. Not at all. Um, the effects are nice. These wide shots of Eregion and the shot of Khazad-dûm. it was nice. I mean, but you know that it's done with computer generation, um, and not with you know, built sets in which you could walk around. Um, yeah, it doesn't feel impressive. I mean, I don't really get an emotional feeling with this. The only thing where I felt something was in the conversation between Durin and Elrond, because it was the only conversation so far that we've had that actually felt like a real conversation. I mean, someone who hasn't seen his friend for 20 years has been wondering where he was, has had a wife and two kids in the meantime, and this guy just suddenly shows up and wants something. I mean, it's the only conversation that I feel would be real. The romance between Bronwyn and Arondir is non-existent. I mean, they say there's a romance, and that's how you know there's a romance, but there's not really any emotions going around. They just, I mean, look at each other fairly blandly. Sometimes a little smile from Bronwyn, but that's it. They don't look in love. They don't look like they are romantically involved. I mean, they're just two adults talking. So it's all very bland, and it really doesn't deserve this praise that it gets. Um, I mean, there are really some nice shots. I mean, I've said it for the first episode. There are some nice shots, but the conversations are really bland, generic, sometimes weird, illogical, um, and sometimes it just doesn't make sense. Um, so yeah, no, this is definitely not worth the praise that it says. You know, it's more Tolkien than Tolkien himself. No, it's not. It's generic fantasy, and I feel that this could have been done with the budget of the Wheel of Time. And you know what else? I think that the Wheel of Time could have been done with the budget of the Wheel of Time, because the Wheel of Time is also so generic, that it's terrible. It's a terrible mistreatment of a beautiful book series that is so massive in scope. I mean, 12,000 pages um, of of you know, story of character development that you get in the Wheel of Time. Um, so it's a massive epic, and it's reduced to this generic drivel, just like this. It's terrible. Um, if you look at it from that perspective, if you look at it from just, if you separate it from Tolkien, the show is, it's not good. It's not terrible. It's just generic. It's maybe a 4 or 5 out of 10, but not more. But they want to convey it as Tolkien, but they can't make it feel like Tolkien. They just make it feel like another fantasy show, and this is just, you know, it's sad. The second episode might have been a little bit better um, than the first in terms of story consistency, but uh, it's not boding well. It's not really good. So anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below, and see you in the next one. Goodbye.